In the spring of 1945, the Pacific Ocean was witnessing one of the most brutal and bloody campaigns of World War II. The Battle of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, had begun on April 1st of that year with the largest amphibious assault ever mounted in the Pacific theater. More than 1,600 ships and 350,000 naval personnel formed an armada of gigantic proportions, aiming to conquer the last major barrier before mainland Japan itself. The island of Okinawa, 70 miles long, was strategic not only because of its location, but because its capture would allow the United States to establish forward bases for strategic bombing and for the planned final invasion of Japan. But the Japanese Empire was not willing to surrender Okinawa without a fight to the death. Facing overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment, Japanese commanders resorted to desperation and fanaticism, implementing on a massive scale the most terrifying tactic of the war, kamikaze attacks. The word kamikaze means divine wind or spiritual wind, evoking the legendary typhoons that saved Japan from Mongol invasions in the 13th century. Now, in 1945, Japanese pilots were transforming into living divine winds, deliberately launching themselves against American ships in suicide missions from which there was no return. Between March and June of 1945, nearly 2,000 suicide attacks would be launched against the Allied fleet, in a hell of fire and steel that American sailors would never forget. The American defensive strategy on Okinawa required a network of radar picket ships, positioned at stations around the island to detect approaching enemy aircraft and alert the main fleet. These picket stations were the most dangerous outposts in the entire operation. The destroyers assigned to this duty patrolled alone or in small groups 75 to 100 miles from the coast, positioned directly in the path of Japanese aircraft flying from the mainland towards Okinawa. They were the first target the kamikazes encountered and were too far from the main fleet to receive adequate protection from the anti-aircraft artillery of larger ships or fighter cover. The sailors aboard these picket destroyers called their missions graveyard duty due to the extreme vulnerability and danger. They remained on combat duty for hours, sometimes days at a time, their nerves frayed, constantly watching the sky, knowing that the next attack could be their last. Of the 149 Allied vessels sunk or damaged by kamikazes during Okinawa, 88 were destroyers and similar vessels, and 30 were destroyer escorts. Of the 14 destroyers that the United States Navy lost at Okinawa, 10 were sunk while serving as radar picket ships. It was without a doubt the deadliest mission of the naval battle. The USS Mannert L Abele was one of those destroyers condemned to the graveyard shift. Built at the Bath Iron Works shipyards in Maine, it had been launched on April 23, 1944, and commissioned just 3 months later, on July 4th. It was an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, one of the most modern destroyer classes in the American Navy, with a length of 15 meters, a maximum speed of 34 knots, and heavy armament that included 6 5-inch guns, 12 40mm guns, 11 20mm guns, and 10 torpedo tubes. The ship was named after Lieutenant Commander Mannert Lincoln Abele, born in Quincy, Massachusetts, in July 1903. Mannert Abele had assumed command of the submarine USS Grunion, which disappeared in waters near Kiska, Alaska, in July 1942 after allegedly sinking 3 Japanese ships in a single day. For this feat, he posthumously received the Navy Cross. The submarine Grunion would remain lost for 65 years until Abele's own sons found it in 2006 in a search that lasted 4 years. Now, the destroyer that bore this hero's name was about to share his tragic fate. After its commissioning, the Mannert L Abele served as a training ship in Chesapeake Bay before departing for the Pacific in October 1944. It arrived at Pearl Harbor in November and underwent 2 weeks of intensive training before sailing to the Western Pacific in December. The destroyer was converted into a fighter directorship, receiving special radar and radio equipment, and completed training as a radar picket ship before departing for the invasion of Iwo Jima in January 1945. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, from February to March, the Abele protected Admiral Richmond Turner's transport force and served in the bombardment line, providing valuable naval gunfire support for the Marines ashore. Between March 3rd and 4th and again between March 8th and 10th, the destroyer's guns thundered against Japanese positions on the volcanic island, helping to advance the land campaign. On March 10th, it sailed for Ulithi, arriving 2 days later. The Abele departed Ulithi on March 20th for radar picket duty and the following day joined Task Force 54, Rear Admiral Mortondeo's naval covering and fire force for the invasion of Okinawa. The crew of 336 men, commanded by Commander Alton E. Parker, was about to face the ultimate test of courage and endurance. The Abele arrived in the Ryukyus on March 24, 1945, and during the following week protected heavy shore bombardment ships during pre-invasion operations from Kuramaredo to I.E. Shima. The destroyer bombarded enemy positions and supported submarine demolition team operations on the proposed assault beaches of Okinawa. When American troops stormed the beaches on April 1st, the Mannert L Abele provided close fire support before beginning radar picket patrols northeast of Okinawa. It was a mission that placed it directly in the path of danger, and the following days were a constant ordeal of vigilance and combat against successive waves of Japanese air attacks. On April 6th, the first of 10 major Kikisui, or floating chrysanthemum, offensives began coordinated mass attacks by hundreds of suicide aircraft. The Abele and other picket destroyers faced wave after wave of kamikazes, their cannons thundering constantly against the sky. The sailors remained at their combat posts for endless shifts, exhausted, but knowing that a moment of inattention could mean death for everyone on board. Between March and June, the kamikaze attacks would cause more than 49,000 American casualties, including more than 12,000 dead, and the Navy would suffer its worst losses of the war, greater even than Pearl Harbor. For the first 2 weeks of April, fate seemed to favor the Abele. The ship survived intense air attacks, its gunnery crews shooting down numerous enemy aircraft and avoiding serious damage. But on April 12, 1945, the same day President Franklin Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, the Mannert L Abele's luck finally ran out. The destroyer was operating in the East China Sea, approximately 75 miles north of Okinawa, at radar picket station number 14, one of the most exposed and dangerous positions in the entire operation. It was a clear morning, and the ship's radar was functioning perfectly when it began detecting multiple Japanese aircraft approaching at high speed. The Abele's crew rushed to their fighting stations. Everyone knew what was coming. The anti-aircraft guns turned toward the threats, and seconds later the first Japanese aircraft became visible on the horizon. What followed was a hell of fire and destruction that would last only 3 minutes, but would seem like an eternity to those who lived through it. The destroyer's guns opened fire immediately, their trained crews working feverishly to shoot down the attackers. Abele's gunners managed to damage several enemy aircraft, but the kamikazes kept coming, determined to complete their suicide missions. Then, a pilot managed to penetrate the anti-aircraft fire barrier. His plane, already damaged and ablaze, dove towards the destroyer and crashed into its starboard side near the aft boiler room. The explosion was terrible, with the plane penetrating as far as the aft engine room. Flames and black smoke spewed from the area struck. The impact killed many sailors instantly and injured dozens more. Most of the men killed in this first impact were trapped in the aft boiler room, which quickly filled with superheated steam, cooking alive those who hadn't been killed by the initial explosion. Shrapnel also flew upwards, tearing apart the exposed men on the main deck. The ship's power system was severely damaged, and the Abele began to lose speed and maneuverability. The crew was desperately fighting to contain the damage, extinguish the fires, and save their wounded companions. But they would have no chance of recovery. Just a minute after the initial impact, while the crew of the Abele was still reeling from the shock of processing what had happened, a second threat emerged from the sky. This one was unlike anything the American sailors had ever seen before. It was a Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, one of the most diabolical and desperate weapons ever conceived by man. The name Oka meant cherry blossom in Japanese, evoking the ephemeral beauty of life, but the Americans nicknamed it Baka, meaning idiot or fool, an insult both to the weapon and to the concept of suicidal sacrifice it represented. The Oka had been conceived in the summer of 1944 by Imperial Japanese Navy midshipman Mitsuo Oda, assisted by students from the University of Tokyo's Aeronautical Research Institute. It was essentially a manned cruise missile, a human-guided flying bomb born from the desperation of an empire that knew it was losing the war. The Japanese Navy had decided that the idea had merit, and engineers at the Yokosuka Naval Aviation Technical Arsenal created the formal designs for what would become the MXY-7. The only model that entered service was Model 11, and about 852 were built, although only about 755 of the Model 11 were produced for operational use. The Oka was a small aircraft, less than 6 meters long and 5 meters wingspan, constructed primarily of wood with an aluminum fuselage to save precious materials. It had no landing gear because it was a one-way mission. The pilot's cabin contained only the essentials: rudimentary controls and a seat for the man who was going to die. In the nose of the aircraft was a 1,200-kilogram warhead of ammonal explosive designed to destroy even the largest warships. In the rear were mounted 3 Type 4 Mark I Model 20 solid-fuel rockets, which would provide the final thrust for the suicidal dive. The Oka was transported under the belly of a Mitsubishi G4M2E Model 24J Betty bomber to about 37 kilometers from the target. Once released, the Oka pilot would glide toward the designated target, and when close enough, would fire the solid-fuel rockets, one at a time or all together, accelerating the flying bomb to terrifying speeds of 650 kilometers per hour in level flight and up to 930 or even 1,000 kilometers per hour in a dive. At this speed, it was virtually impossible to intercept or destroy the Oka, and the final approach was impossible to abort once the rockets were fired. The kamikaze pilot had only seconds to make course corrections before the final impact. The Oka pilot, now descending toward the Mannert L Abele, had been released from his Betty bomber minutes earlier. He had planned silently, conserving altitude and speed, waiting for the right moment. Seeing the already damaged and burning American destroyer below him, he must have smiled, knowing his target was wounded and vulnerable. Then he fired his 3 solid-fuel rockets. The acceleration was instantaneous and brutal, throwing the pilot against his seat as the Oka shot forward like a bullet. From the deck of the Abele, the gunners saw the Oka emerge from the fog and dive toward them at incomprehensible speed. There was no time to react, no time to turn the guns, no time for anything. From the moment the Oka was sighted until impact, only 5 seconds elapsed. A sailor aboard the destroyer USS Shi, which would be hit by an Oka 3 weeks later on May 4th, would later describe the experience. Just 5 seconds after the rocket was spotted emerging from the fog, the accident occurred. The Shi's gunners didn't even have a chance to intercept it. If it was like that on the Shi, it must have been the same or worse on the Abele, already damaged and with compromised systems. Oka struck Mannert L Abele directly at the waterline in the midships area. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, far beyond anything a single conventional kamikaze aircraft could cause. 1,200 kilograms of explosives detonated with unimaginable force. creating a massive fireball and shockwave that spread throughout the entire ship. The explosion literally shattered the destroyer's structure, causing an instantaneous deformation that made the bow and stern rapidly bend upwards. The middle of the ship simply disappeared in a cloud of fire, smoke, and debris. Teaching Adair, who was on deck, realized within a minute of the impact that the Abele was breaking in two. As he could see the aft half rapidly filling up, the deck had sunk close to the water. All the sailors on the aft half were abandoning the Abele. From the sea, the crewmen who had abandoned ship could see the vessel bending in half, with the bow and stern far out of the water. The two enormous propellers and twin rudders had risen above the water and were still spinning. A surreal and terrifying spectacle that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It was an apocalyptic image, a modern warship literally breaking in half like a toy. According to official records, less than 2 minutes elapsed from the moment of the second kamikaze impact until the Abele completely disappeared beneath the waves. From the first conventional kamikaze impact until the ship sank completely, only 3 minutes passed. With only 1 minute between the two kamikaze attacks, it was one of the fastest sinkings of an American destroyer in all of World War II. The speed of the sinking meant that many sailors were trapped in flooded sections or could not escape in time. Those who managed to reach the deck threw themselves into the sea, swimming desperately to get away from the sinking ship, fearing being sucked into the whirlpool when it disappeared. The sea quickly became filled with wreckage, burning oil, and men fighting for their lives in the water. Many were severely injured, burned, or in shock. Oil spilled from the destroyer's fuel tanks covered the surface of the water, and in some places it was on fire, creating a deadly barrier that survivors had to swim through or around. Some men simply didn't have the strength anymore after everything they had been through and drowned before they could be rescued. Other American ships in the area rushed to rescue the survivors of the Abele. The small LCS support vessels, landing support craft equipped with heavy anti-aircraft weaponry that frequently accompanied the radar picket destroyers, quickly arrived on the scene and began pulling men from the water. The rescue sailors worked feverishly, knowing that more kamikaze attacks could come at any moment. They pulled exhausted, wounded, and traumatized men aboard, many of them so weak they could barely cling to the cargo nets that were thrown overboard from the rescue ships. A survivor of the destroyer Morrison, which would be sunk by kamikazes that same month, would later recall, "I couldn't climb the cargo net, I was so exhausted." This was true for many of the Abele survivors as well. After hours in the water, battling the waves, the oil, their injuries, and the psychological shock of what they had experienced, many were on the verge of complete collapse. When the final count was made, 84 sailors from the USS Mannert L Abele had perished. Some died instantly on impact, vaporized by explosions, or killed by shrapnel. Others were trapped inside the destroyer as it sank, dragged to the depths within flooded compartments. And some succumbed to injuries, burns, or simply to the sea before they could be rescued. The survivors were taken to Guam to await transport back home, while the most seriously injured recovered aboard the hospital ship Mercy, the USS Mannert L Abele had the sad and terrible distinction of being the first American warship to be sunk by an Oka rocket bomb, one of the first cruise missiles in history. It was a weapon born of utter desperation, a symbol of the fanatical determination of an empire that preferred to sacrifice its own men in the most horrific way rather than admit defeat. The Oka represented the ultimate evolution of kamikaze doctrine, transforming pilots into projectiles guided by humans, eliminating any pretense of survival or rescue. Conventional zero kamikaze fighter pilots at least flew real aircraft, and in theory could abort their missions if they didn't find suitable targets, although in practice they rarely did. But Oka pilots didn't have that option. Once the rockets were launched, there was no turning back. It was guaranteed death, and everyone knew it. Ensign Mitsuo Oda, who conceived the weapon, was effectively creating flying execution chambers for his own countrymen. During the war, the Oka had limited operational success. Although terrifying in theory, in practice the weapon had serious limitations. Its range was extremely short, only 37 kilometers, which meant that the Betty bombers carrying them had to get dangerously close to their targets before releasing the Okas, making them vulnerable to American fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. The first attack using Okas occurred in March 1945 and was a complete disaster, with all 8 Betty bombers being shot down before they could release their payloads, killing all the Oka pilots without scoring a single hit. The Americans immediately nicknamed the new weapon Baka. Despite its devastating potential, only 7 American ships were sunk or seriously damaged by Okas throughout the entire war, and no major capital warships were sunk by one. Besides the Mannert L Abele, the destroyer USS She was damaged by an Oka on May 4th, and some transport ships and smaller vessels were also hit. Compared to the thousands of conventional kamikaze attacks that sank 36 ships and damaged another 368 during Okinawa, the Oka was relatively ineffective, but its psychological impact was profound. The very existence of such a weapon, Japan's willingness to turn young men into disposable missiles, spoke of the desperate ferocity with which the enemy would fight to the end. And for the 84 men who died on the Mannert L Abele, the debate about effectiveness was irrelevant. They paid the ultimate price, becoming the first American casualties of this terrible weapon. The Battle of Okinawa continued until June 22, 1945, nearly 3 months of brutal carnage on land and sea. The casualties were staggering. On the American side, approximately 49,000 combat casualties, including over 12,000 dead. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the 10th Army, killed by artillery fire on June 18th, the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the Pacific Theater. Also killed was the beloved war correspondent Ernie Pyle. The Navy suffered its worst losses of the war, with nearly 5,000 sailors killed and another 5,000 wounded, more than the losses at Pearl Harbor. About 40% of the American deaths on Okinawa were Navy personnel killed by kamikazes. On the Japanese side, over 100,000 defenders died, fighting with fanatical determination to almost the last man. But the greatest casualties were among the Okinawan civilians. Approximately 150,000 Okinawans, out of a population of roughly 500,000, were killed during the campaign. Many were caught in the crossfire, but tens of thousands were deliberately killed, forced to commit suicide by Japanese propaganda that convinced them the Americans would torture and kill them, or were used as human shields and forced to participate in suicide attacks. The Japanese army had forcibly enlisted tens of thousands of native Okinawans, including women and children. It was one of the most horrific civilian tragedies of the entire war. The cost of Okinawa was so high that it forced President Harry Truman and the chiefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to reconsider their plans to invade Japan's main islands. If a relatively small and isolated island like Okinawa cost 50,000 American casualties, how many would die in an invasion of Kyushu or Honshu, where Japan could concentrate millions of defenders, including the entire civilian population armed with bamboo spears? Estimates reached 1 million or more American casualties and multiple millions of Japanese civilian deaths. Anxious to avoid this apocalyptic bloodbath, and urged on by the increasing cost of continuing conventional warfare, the prospect of a swift end through the use of atomic weapons became increasingly attractive. Okinawa not only demonstrated the fanatical determination with which Japan would fight to the end, but also showed the limits of what American forces could endure. The lessons of Okinawa led directly to the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, bringing the war to an abrupt end and preventing the planned invasion. For decades after the war, the USS Mannert L Abele lay lost in the depths of the East China Sea, a war grave approximately 1,400 meters deep, its exact location unknown. The 84 men who died with the ship lay in their final resting place, guarded only by the dark, silent waters of the ocean. The families of the lost never had a specific place to mourn, never knew exactly where their loved ones rested. But in December 2022, 77 years after the sinking, ocean explorer Tim Taylor and his team from Project Lost 52 located the wreckage of the destroyer off the north coast of Okinawa. Project Lost 52 is dedicated to finding and identifying the 52 American submarines lost during World War II. But Taylor's team also searches for other lost ships when opportunities arise. For Taylor, the discovery of the Mannert L Abele was deeply personal and emotional. His own father had served in the Navy during the Battle of Okinawa aboard the USS Telfire and witnessed firsthand a kamikaze attack similar to the one that destroyed the Abele just days before. "My father was close to the same fate as the Abele crew just days before," Taylor stated. "That connected me to my father. It was a very emotional discovery for me." The identification of the wreckage was confirmed in May 2023 by the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command using information provided by Taylor's team. The command's underwater archaeology branch examined the data and confirmed that the wreckage was definitely from the USS Mannert L Abele. The shipwreck site now has protected status under U.S. law and falls under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Navy, while non-intrusive actions such as remote sensing documentation are permitted on sunken military vessels belonging to the United States Navy. Any activities that have the potential to disturb these sunken vessels must be coordinated with the Naval History and Heritage Command. The site is officially recognized as a war grave, the final resting place of 84 American sailors. The director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, retired Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, stated in an official statement, "Mannert L Abele is the final resting place of 84 American sailors who made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of their country. My deepest thanks and congratulations to Tim Taylor and his team for discovering this shipwreck site. Their discovery allows some closure for the families of those lost and gives us all another opportunity to remember and honor them." Today, the USS Mannert L Abele rests on the ocean floor off Okinawa, a silent and somber monument to the courage of those who served, the brutality of war, and the terrible price of freedom. The ship received 2 battle stars for its wartime service, a recognition of its contributions at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Its crew fought bravely against overwhelming odds, shooting down multiple enemy aircraft and fulfilling their duty to the bitter end. They stood no chance against the devastating combination of a conventional kamikaze followed a minute later by an Hoka rocket bomb, yet they fought to the last second. The story of the Mannert L Abele is a reminder that war is not just about strategies and statistics, but about individual human lives, each precious and unique, sacrificed on the altar of conflict between nations. It is a story about young men torn from their homes and families, placed on steel ships in the middle of the ocean, and asked to face an enemy willing to die to kill them. It is a story about the weight of duty, courage under fire, and ultimate sacrifice. The 84 men who died on the Abele left behind fathers, wives, sons, brothers, sisters, friends, and lovers. Their lives were cut short prematurely, their futures stolen by a war that consumed millions. But their memory remains, guarded in the depths of the ocean, preserved in historical records, and honored by those who remember their sacrifice. The destroyer USS Mannert L Abele may have sunk in 3 minutes on a day in April 1945, but the legacy of its crew endures, a lasting testament to the cost of war and the courage of those who fought to defend freedom against tyranny.